The fire crackled low, casting flickers of gold onto faces once marked by war. A cowboy in a denim shirt handed her a plate, brisket, cornbread, something sweet she didn't recognize, but it wasn't the food that undid her. It was the quiet voice from the harmonica, playing behind her as if it knew her sorrow. Then came the invitation, low and uncertain. "You sing?" She froze, ribs trembling. For 3 years she had hidden her voice, taught it silence. But now, with the scent of smoked meat in her lungs and the soft eyes of her captors watching, not as victors but as men, she nodded. She sang, a lullaby from home. At first her voice cracked, then it rose, threadbare but true. The guards didn't laugh. They listened. One wiped his eyes. The girl beside her began to sob. They'd been prisoners. They expected punishment. But here, under the Texas stars, wrapped in a wool blanket, she found something closer to ruinous. Permission. To sing. To be human again. Before the campfires and cornbread, there was only silence. Not the soft kind that comes with rest, but the silence of women who had marched through the wreckage of empire, heads bowed, uniforms soiled, eyes fixed on a horizon that no longer promised anything. They had believed in duty, in the emperor, in the words whispered through barracks and blood, that surrender was worse than death. When Japan fell, these women, nurses, clerks, switchboard operators, were caught in a net of contradiction. They had followed orders. They had served faithfully. But now they were no longer warriors, and they were not civilians either. They were something in between, captives who carried the shame of surviving. They did not weep when the Americans arrived. They did not beg. Their backs remained straight, even when the rifles were lowered. They had rehearsed this moment in nightmares, the rough hands, the spitting curses, the humiliation of defeat. Yet when it came, it was quiet. The American guards gave orders, yes, but without venom. They handed out canteens of water. One soldier even bowed slightly, not in mockery, but in confused politeness. This civility was not comforting. It was disorienting. The women expected cruelty. Instead, they were handed blankets. The train that carried them rolled across the belly of a country they had only known in caricatures. The land was vast, dust-blown, studded with fields and low hills. Some women squinted at the cows dotting the plains and whispered that this must be punishment disguised, the barbed wire they expected, and it greeted them soon enough, spiraled neatly around a camp outside a Texas town with a name they couldn't pronounce. But beyond the wire, something was wrong. The sky was impossibly blue. The guards were young. And the gates didn't clang shut with finality. They creaked softly, like the door to a barn. Inside, they were counted, catalogued, sorted like packages. No one shouted. No one struck them. The women stood stiffly as they were handed uniforms, clean cotton, rough but whole. They were led to barracks that smelled of sawdust, not fear. Bunk beds lined the walls. A stove sat in the corner. One woman whispered that it reminded her of the rural boarding school she had hated as a child. Another replied, "This is worse. This is confusing." The heat was different from the jungles. It was dry, pressing, and relentless. Dust clung to their legs. Flies hovered lazily, indifferent to the end of war. The air buzzed with a stillness that felt artificial. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave, and so the women remained frozen inside themselves, untouched by kindness, wary of it. Every movement was measured, every glance was withheld. At night they lay in rows under thin blankets, their bodies tense, ears straining for signs of danger that never came. Some hummed lullabies under their breath, old songs their mothers used to sing, but even that was done with guilt, as though melody itself might betray them. No one dared to raise her voice. Singing was for free people, and they were not free. They did not know what they were anymore. In the early days, no one spoke unless spoken to. When the Americans offered second helpings of bread, few accepted. When one guard left a harmonica on a bench outside the mess hall, no one touched it. It sat there for 3 days, baking in the sun, until finally a gust of wind knocked it over. Even then, the women only watched. To make music was to admit something they weren't ready to feel. Shame doesn't always come with shouting or bruises. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, in hot showers, in slices of meat too thick to ignore. These women had trained to endure suffering, but not mercy. They were ready to be broken by pain. But kindness, this strange, quiet American kindness, unraveled them differently, slowly, invisibly, from the inside out. And so, in those first weeks, they spoke little, sang never, and waited for the punishment that never came. What they could not see yet was that their silence wasn't protecting them. It was only prolonging the moment when they would have to face something far more unbearable than cruelty, recognition, because someday soon someone would ask them to sing. It began with a smell no one had expected: mesquite wood, smoke, and sizzling meat. That Sunday, the guards told them to line up, not for inspection, but for something else. They didn't understand the words, only the gestures. The gates opened. Slowly, warily, the women walked, past the barracks, past the wire, toward the field beyond the mess hall where a cluster of Americans waited. Some wore military shirts rolled up at the sleeves, others wore denim and cowboy hats. Real ones, tilted against the sun. One was flipping meat over a steel drum smoker, another stirred something in a pot. Laughter drifted through the air. Not mockery, real, relaxed laughter. A radio hummed faintly from somewhere out of sight. And the smell was everywhere, thick, savory, intoxicating. Brisket, cornbread, beans kissed with sugar. The women froze, eyes wide, as though they'd stumbled into a hallucination. This was not the face of the enemy they had rehearsed in their minds. This was a picnic, and yet there were the rifles, slung lazily over shoulders. This was still a prison, but no one barked orders, no one pointed. Instead, one of the Americans, his boots dusty, his belt fastened with a brass steerhead, waved a hand toward the blankets on the ground. He smiled, then pointed to the food. One of the women, a former nurse from Nagasaki, clutched her sleeves and whispered, "What is this?" Another murmured, "A trick. It must be." But their stomachs were louder than their suspicion. Hunger has its own language. Still, none of them moved until one of the guards sat down with a plate and began to eat, slowly, casually, like it meant nothing. That gesture broke the spell. The first woman stepped forward, trembling. She accepted the plate with 2 hands. On it, a thick cut of beef, a biscuit glistening with butter, something orange and sweet-smelling that she would later learn was candied yams. The American who served her didn't smirk. He didn't leer. He simply nodded and motioned for the next woman. One by one they came. The line formed, the plates filled. They sat in silence on the blankets, the food warm in their laps, the air too bright to trust. They did not speak. They ate, slowly, as though expecting the first bite to vanish. Yuki, who hadn't spoken aloud in 3 days, looked down at her plate and then at the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills was Japan, bombed, broken, burning. Here, in the land of the enemy, the meat fell apart in her mouth with a softness she hadn't tasted in years. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from memory. The last time she had eaten beef was the week before her brother died in Okinawa. She chewed slowly, as if that memory might shatter if she swallowed too fast. Across from her, another girl bit into cornbread and made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. She covered her mouth quickly, ashamed, but no one mocked her. The Americans just kept serving. The cowboys turned brisket. One of them whistled a tune. It wasn't a military march. It was something lazy, country, unbothered by the scars of war. And that was the most disarming thing of all. The women were prepared to endure punishment. They had armored themselves against rage, against cruelty. But this easy kindness, this unceremonious abundance, was harder to bear, because it made them feel human again. And to feel human, after being told your value ended with defeat, was a kind of betrayal. Some couldn't eat. They stared at their plates as if the food might speak. Others devoured each bite with mechanical efficiency, eyes unfocused, minds elsewhere. But the dissonance lingered. The enemy was not starving them. He was feeding them, not with scraps, but with warmth. The sky overhead was huge and cloudless. A breeze stirred the dust. A dog wandered past, tail wagging, as if this were any Sunday in any small town anywhere in the world. Except it wasn't. It was a prison camp. It was supposed to be shame. But on that field, under the weight of barbecue smoke and magnolia air, the myth cracked. Not completely, not yet. But for the first time since their capture, the women looked at their captors and didn't see monsters. They saw men who cooked too much meat and offered too many smiles. And that was more dangerous than any whip, because it planted a seed, and that seed would grow roots, not in the stomach, but in the soul. But just as something fragile began to stir in them, curiosity, even wonder, it was overtaken by something older and darker. As the women sat cross-legged on blankets, paper plates balanced in their laps, the smoke from the barbecue curled upward like incense, twisting through memories they had long buried. It didn't take much to awaken them. The hiss of meat on the grill sounded to some like gunfire. The scent of smoke echoed jungle fires. One woman blinked and saw her sister's face in the rising steam, a face she'd last seen in Saipan, streaked with blood and ash. Another froze mid-bite, her fork trembling inches from her lips, gripped by the memory of pulling maggots from a soldier's thigh as mortars fell around her in the Philippines. The brutality of the Pacific theater had not left their bodies. It had merely been packed away in silence. The heat, the blood, the screams, those things did not vanish when uniforms were stripped away and replaced with clean linens and brisket. They lived beneath the surface of every smile, every breeze, every too-kind gesture that now surrounded them in this camp. For years, their suffering had been the proof of their purpose. They had endured the rot of jungle wounds, the starvation of sieges, the dread of defeat, not as weakness, but as honor. Their officers had drilled it into them until the words were bone deep, better to die than to be taken. Capture was a betrayal not just of the state, but of ancestry. One nurse had tattooed her brother's name on her thigh as a vow of vengeance. Another had hidden a cyanide capsule in her boot heel, never used, still there. These were women who had trained for martyrdom, and yet here they sat, eating beef slow-cooked by men in cowboy hats who asked them if they wanted peach cobbler with their plate. It was not violence that broke them. It was peace. Peace, when it came not through victory but through surrender, was harder to accept. The mind rebelled. One moment they were soldiers, the next they were guests at a barbecue hosted by the enemy. And still, the Americans offered more food. They asked no questions. They gave no lectures. They simply served seconds. The kindness was unbearable, because it forced these women to confront what had been stolen from them, their agency, their grief, their right to mourn or speak or even remember out loud. They had spent years becoming instruments of war, swallowing pain without flinching. But now, handed a paper plate and a spoon, they felt something worse than fear. They felt. One woman, a former translator who had once watched a child die in a cratered village, tried to stand, but collapsed. The food lay scattered across her lap. She did not move. She sobbed, shoulders shaking. An American guard crouched beside her, unsure what to do. He reached forward and gently brushed the beans from her skirt. She did not thank him. She could not. Her mouth had forgotten how to form softness. This was what no one had prepared them for, that after so much brutality, kindness would be the sharpest knife. That a camp surrounded by wire, staffed by strangers, filled with foreign sounds and smells, could unravel them more than the battlefield ever did, because it made them question everything. If the enemy could be gentle, who had truly protected them? If the Americans saw them as women, not objects, not enemies, not ghosts, what did that make of the empire they had bled for? The wind changed. Somewhere a harmonica played a broken tune. The women didn't move. They sat with their plates cooling on their laps, their hands still, their eyes unfocused. They had eaten more in one meal than they had in weeks on the front. But it wasn't the fullness that overwhelmed them. It was the dissonance. They were alive. And that, too, hurt. That night, dusk slipped quietly into starlight as if trying not to disturb anyone. The smoke from the barbecue still clung to their clothes, but the scent of firewood had turned soft, almost sweet. The women sat in a loose circle just beyond the mess hall, their bodies stiff from the long day, their hearts heavier than before. It might have ended there, in silence, in fatigue, but one of the American cooks stepped forward, cradling a harmonica like a secret. He didn't say anything. He just sat on a wooden stool and started to play. The notes wavered, off-key at times. Nothing polished, nothing performed. But the tune carried, simple, slow, familiar only to him, but gentle enough to cross borders. It filled the open space between barbed wire and sky with something that felt dangerously like peace. Then a voice joined him. It was higher, younger, a child's voice. The daughter of the cook, no older than 10, stood barefoot on the grass, her dress wrinkled from the long day. She'd been silent during the meal, clinging shyly to her father's side, her wide eyes watching the foreign women with the soft curiosity only children possess. But now she sang. The melody was something old and local, Texas folk, maybe, or a lullaby passed down through generations. She didn't sing to impress. She sang like she did at home, with her mother in the kitchen or with the dog curled up at her feet, pure, unguarded, untarnished by politics or history. The Japanese women froze. Some turned away. One lowered her head, as if the sound itself were too much to bear. And then the girl, her voice trailing off with a kind of innocent wonder, looked around at them and asked a question no guard had dared voice. "What songs do you sing back home?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. The silence that followed was not cold. It was weighty, crushing. It wasn't that the women had no answer. It was that they had forgotten how to reach for it. Songs belonged to kitchens, to rice fields, to babies rocked on knees and grandmothers stirring pots. Songs were from a world that had ended. One woman, the same former nurse who had frozen mid-bite earlier, opened her mouth, then closed it again. Another clutched the edge of her blanket until her knuckles turned white. Then, from the far edge of the circle, came a whisper. It was so quiet it could have been mistaken for wind. "They do not let us sing?" The girl tilted her head. "Why not?" No one answered. The harmonica player didn't press. He simply picked up the tune again, quieter now, letting the notes drift between them like fireflies. A few of the women watched him, something shifting behind their eyes. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was no longer fear. Music, it turned out, did not need translation. That night marked something unspoken. The moment when a child's question, simple, genuine, untainted, broke through where kindness and food could not. The girl had not tried to heal them. She had not tried to understand. She had only asked gently what they remembered, and in doing so reminded them that they still could. They did not sing that night, but some hummed to themselves as they walked back to the barracks. Others mouthed the lyrics of songs they hadn't spoken aloud in years. A few closed their eyes and heard, faintly, the echoes of lullabies they thought they'd lost. The harmonica played one last note as the stars deepened overhead. No applause, no command, just the shared breath of two worlds that, for a moment, breathed in rhythm. And far from the Pacific, far from surrender, a question had been planted, one that would not let them rest. What if singing could be survival, too? Her name was Yuki. She had once been known for her voice, not her silence. Before the war, she'd been a student at a conservatory in Osaka where she studied traditional Japanese music and Western opera with equal fervor. Her instructors praised the clarity of her soprano, the way it could rise and fall like a brushstroke on parchment. But music had no place in the empire's factories of war. When the bombings intensified and conscription spread its fingers into the homes of even the most gifted students, her voice was deemed expendable. She was given a uniform and a radio headset. Her new job was to relay messages between command posts and field units, her soprano replaced by static and code. The music school was closed by the end of that year. Her scores were burned with the rest of the civilian clutter. Years later, in a Texas field wrapped in night, she found herself standing again. Not on a stage, but on dry grass. Not in front of peers, but in front of guards. Her hands trembled as she lifted them to her chest. She did not know what compelled her forward. Perhaps it was the little girl's question, or the harmonica's lazy tune, or the unbearable ache of silence that had filled her lungs for too long. She had not sung since the war began, not even once. She was afraid her voice would crack, that it had forgotten her, that she no longer deserved it. And yet, something in her chest stirred as she stepped forward. The other women watched, eyes wide, still, and holding their breath. The Americans fell quiet, confused, their plates forgotten on laps and tables. Even the harmonica player lowered his instrument. Yuki stood beneath the open sky, the stars bright and unblinking, and began to sing. The first note came fragile and thin, like a thread drawn too tight. Her breath caught, but she kept going. Slowly, carefully, she shaped a melody from memory. An old folk song about plum blossoms blooming in snow. The kind of song mothers sang to daughters while brushing their hair, or grandmothers hummed as they folded kimonos. She sang not for applause or defiance, but as if remembering how to breathe in her own skin. The sound drifted over the camp like smoke from the earlier fire. The language meant nothing to the Americans, but the tone did, the sorrow, the fragility, the way her voice wavered and then strengthened like a sapling bending in wind but refusing to break. One of the cowboys removed his hat. Another leaned forward, elbows on his knees, unmoving. They understood nothing and everything. When Yuki reached the final note, she let it hang in the air a heartbeat longer than necessary, then bowed her head. She did not know what would follow. A command to stop, laughter, silence. But what came next undid her more than anything else. They clapped. Not loud, not rowdy, not the kind of applause meant for entertainment. It was slow, unsure, reverent. One cowboy gave a soft whoop, but then hushed himself. Another touched his chest and nodded, eyes glistening. It was not the song they understood. It was the courage it took to sing it. Among the women, something cracked open. One wept openly, head in her hands. Another reached out and brushed Yuki's sleeve with her fingers, as if touching a miracle. No one said the word, but they all felt it. Dignity. Yuki sat back down without a word. Her knees were shaking, her throat ached, but her face was calm. She had crossed a line no one else had dared, and the world had not ended. It had listened. The next Sunday, the women returned to the field not as silent prisoners, but as something changed. Not free, never free, but less afraid. The fire was already burning when they arrived, the smell of oak wood mixing with hickory smoke. The cowboys were there again, wearing the same faded shirts and sun-worn hats, turning meat over iron grates like it was the most natural thing in the world. But now, the Japanese women didn't wait for orders. They stepped forward willingly, their steps hesitant, but their eyes steadier. The plates were passed out, the blankets laid down. The ritual had begun to feel familiar, and this time more of them sang. Not all, not loudly, but in quiet pockets across the field, voices rose in broken fragments, songs about seasons, about mothers, about rivers. Some forgot the words and started over. One woman, barely 20, began a melody she used to sing with her sisters while hanging laundry back home. Halfway through, her voice faltered. She shook her head, embarrassed, turned away. But a cowboy walked up, wordless, and handed her a checkered handkerchief. She wiped her eyes, then her nose, then laughed, startled by the sound. The man smiled and didn't ask anything. He just returned to the grill, flipped a slab of ribs, and whistled along to nothing in particular. Another guard passed a plate of peach cobbler to the group seated near the edge of the field. The crust was golden, soft with syrup. A woman who hadn't eaten anything sweet since the war began stared at it for a long time before she took a bite. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were full. This was not a performance. There were no stages, no introductions, no applause at the end. There was only the crackle of the fire, the rustle of grass, and the sound of voices, Japanese and English, existing improbably in the same warm space. For a while there were no sides, no war, just songs and meat and a sky so wide it made your chest ache. But behind the sweetness was something sharper, grief. Not just for the war or the homes that no longer existed, but grief that it had taken all of this, defeat, capture, humiliation, for someone to finally look at them and see people. Grief that their voices were only heard after they had lost everything. Grief that the ones showing them compassion now were the very ones they had been taught to hate. The pain wasn't in being fed. It was in realizing that the empire had never done the same. The unraveling came slowly, quietly. A woman who had kept her posture rigid since the first day in the camp finally allowed her shoulders to slump. Another, who hadn't spoken since arriving, asked a guard for more water, then thanked him, softly but clearly. Little cracks in the walls they had built. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but cracks nonetheless. In those moments, connection didn't come through grand gestures. It came through ritual, through repetition, through the quiet rhythm of food being handed over without suspicion, through the shared stillness of watching fire dance over embers, through the act of singing without being told to stop. It was not about language, it was about presence. One guard set down a second harmonica beside the fire pit and walked away. He didn't explain, didn't announce, just left it there, as if offering a key to a door no one was sure they were allowed to open. As night fell, the songs slowed. The women sat closer together now, not just for warmth, but something else. Proximity without fear. Some leaned their heads against one another. A few held hands. A cowboy threw another log on the fire. No one asked them to leave. The air pulsed with quiet tears and the steady hum of something that had no name. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't closure, but it was human, and that was almost too much to bear. Not long after the second Sunday singing, the guards brought pencils and lined paper to the women's barracks. No announcement, no lecture, just the materials and a quiet instruction. Write home. The news traveled slowly through the compound, carried in cautious whispers. At first, no one believed it. Letters? To Japan? It had to be a test. Some of the older women folded the paper into squares and hid them in their mattresses, convinced it was bait. But others sat at the edge of their bunks, pencil trembling in hand, staring down at the blank page like it was a foreign battlefield. What do you say to a homeland that believes you're already dead, or should be? Yuki was one of the first to write. Her letter was short, uneven, the characters small and careful. "Mother," she wrote, "I ate peaches last night. I sang a song. They gave me a blanket. I am not ashamed, but I do not know what that means yet." She didn't mention the barbed wire. She didn't talk about the harmonica or the girl or the firelight. She didn't have to. The truth was in the space between the lines. Others followed. Some wrote about food. "Real meat," one woman noted, "sweet bread, coffee with cream." Some described the quiet, the warmth, the way the Americans called them by name instead of number. One woman simply wrote, "I did not think I would survive, but here I feel alive again." There was no bitterness in the letters, but there was grief and wonder, and confusion so deep it spilled from the pencil like ink made from tears. What none of them knew was that those letters wouldn't reach their families, not intact anyway. The Japanese military intercepted nearly all of them. Censors sat in rooms across Tokyo, reading each line with tight jaws and cold eyes. These were not the letters they had expected. There were no accounts of starvation, beatings, or forced labor. No proof that the Americans were animals. No pleas for vengeance. Instead, they found stories about kindness, about music, about being seen. One officer, upon reading a letter that ended with the sentence, "They let me sing," reportedly snapped his pen in half. "Dangerous lies," he muttered. But the problem was not the words. It was the voices. The women were not offering military secrets. They were offering something more subversive. Testimony. Truth stripped of ideology. These weren't declarations. They were confessions, raw, uncoached, and quietly explosive. Because once a woman says, "I was treated with dignity by my enemy," the myth of the enemy cannot hold, and so the censors filed the letters away. Some were destroyed. Others were used in internal briefings labeled psychological vulnerabilities. A few were leaked to select officers as warnings. "This is how quickly loyalty dissolves," one general remarked. But he was wrong. It wasn't loyalty dissolving. It was silence. Silence unraveling in the face of firelight and song. Back in the camp, the women didn't know what had become of their letters, but they kept writing. Not all were sent. Some were tucked away under mattresses, others folded into books, passed quietly from one woman to another like sacred text. Testimonies of contradiction, records of the days they were allowed to be human. Each word written with hands that had once bandaged wounds, loaded weapons, carried stretchers. The Empire had told them their voices did not matter. That obedience was worth more than truth. But now, in captivity, those same voices had become the only thing that could not be taken, not even by war, not even by shame. In the end, the women did not shout, they did not protest, they wrote. And sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that linger longest. When the announcement came, orders for repatriation, for return to the homeland, the barracks didn't erupt with celebration. There was no cheering, no laughter, no relief. Instead, there was a kind of silence that carried weight, like a room that's just heard bad news. Some women wept, not from joy, but from fear. They had survived war, surrendered pride, and been handed back their humanity by the very hands they had been trained to hate. Now they were being asked to go back into the ruins of the empire that had taken that humanity away. For many, the question wasn't, when do we leave, but what will we become when we do? The trains were scheduled, uniforms folded, bags packed. But it was the intangible things that mattered most in those final days. One guard, the same one who had served peach cobbler and played harmonica by firelight, approached Yuki on the last evening. He didn't speak, just pressed something into her hand. The harmonica, worn smooth at the edges. She looked up. He nodded once. That was all. No speeches, just memory made solid in metal and wood. Other women received parting gifts, scraps of paper with English lyrics carefully printed out, chocolate bars wrapped in cloth, folded handkerchiefs embroidered with initials. One woman received a pencil wrapped in string, the same one she had used to write her first letter home. Another was given a small book of hymns. She was not Christian. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had seen her, remembered her, thought her worth the gesture. Some guards looked away during farewells, uncomfortable with the depth of what had grown between them. Others shook hands, clumsy and brief. A few, bolder or perhaps more affected than they'd admit, offered hugs. The Japanese women, trained in restraint, stood stiffly at first, but one by one the walls cracked. A hand lingered. A whisper of gratitude was spoken. A tear left unbrushed. One woman, her name never spoken in camp, but known to her barracks mates as the one who had sung the lullaby about cranes, clutched her harmonica tightly as she stepped onto the train. Another turned just before boarding, eyes scanning the fence line, the guard tower, the open sky. "Will I be allowed to sing in Tokyo?" she asked no one in particular. No one answered. The question wasn't meant for an answer, because the real question was something deeper. What happens after awakening? What happens when the soul stirs in a place it was never supposed to? Can you return to silence after you've tasted song? Can you go back to ruin after being treated with dignity? The train pulled away slowly, wheels grinding, smoke trailing behind like the last breath of something sacred. Inside, the women sat stiffly, clutching small bundles of memory. But no one looked out the window. It hurt too much. Back in the camp, the fire pit had already gone cold, the blankets folded, the field emptied. But something lingered, the smoke that had curled through the air on those long Sunday nights, the notes of a harmonica drifting upward, the echo of songs sung softly between ribs, and far from the front lines, far from flags and treaties, something had shifted. Not in policy, not in politics, but in people, in women who had once whispered their shame and now carried melodies inside them. Before we move into the final part of the story, we'd love to know, Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. If this story moved you, click the thumbs up button and subscribe below this video. You'll find the button just under the video frame. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a future story from forgotten WWII archives. Every like, sub, and bell press helps us keep telling these powerful untold stories of World War II. Thank you. Tokyo was ash and concrete when they returned. The train pulled into a city they barely recognized, its skyline jagged with broken beams and hollow buildings. Smoke still lingered in some neighborhoods, not from battle, but from the slow, painful burning of what had once been home. The women stepped off the train wearing borrowed coats and shoes too big, their belongings stuffed into duffel bags and memory. They had imagined a return to something, normalcy at the very least. But there were no parades, no arms flung open in relief. No one called them heroes. They were met instead with quiet stares, sidelong glances, and the silence of a nation that no longer knew what to do with survivors. Some of the women found their homes leveled. Others were greeted by relatives who spoke little and asked less. Shame filled the air like dust, coating everything, lingering on every surface. Many were told not to speak of the war. A few tried. Their stories fell into awkward pauses. One woman recounted being given warm blankets by American guards, and her uncle slapped the table, eyes burning, and said, "You were supposed to die with honor." Another whispered that she had sung once beside a fire, and her sister looked away, tears rising fast. There was no place for what they carried. The Japan they returned to demanded resilience, but offered no refuge. Yuki found her parents alive, thinner but whole. Her father barely met her eyes, unsure of who had returned in the shape of his daughter. Her mother held her for a long time, then said only, "You must forget it all." Yuki nodded, but forgetting was not the same as healing. She did not sing again in public. She found work as a teacher at a local school, music theory, not performance. She instructed children on scales, on tempo, on posture. She watched them press keys and strike strings and shape sound with their mouths. Sometimes she would demonstrate, but only briefly. Never the songs she had once known, never the ones she had sung under Texas skies. Her voice, so carefully reawakened, was folded away again. Not from shame, but from reverence. Every spring, when the plum blossoms bloomed and the wind turned soft, she would take out the harmonica. She kept it wrapped in cloth, stored in a wooden box beneath her bed. She never told her students where it came from, never explained the meaning behind the strange instrument resting in her palm. She would sit by the open window, the blossoms brushing against the sill, and she would play, quietly, just a few bars, enough to bring back the scent of firewood and sweet beans, the warmth of a wool blanket, the laughter of a cowboy, the question of a little girl. Enough to remember who she had been when someone finally allowed her to be. Others from the camp faded into the silence of post-war life. Some married, some never spoke of their time in captivity again. But in quiet kitchens and back rooms, fragments of their stories survived. One woman left a journal filled with song lyrics. Another passed on a recipe for cornbread to her granddaughter and called it cowboy cake. A third, at her deathbed, whispered, "They let me sing," as though it were both confession and benediction. Awakening carries a cost. To have seen mercy where there should have been hate. To have tasted tenderness from the hands of an enemy, to have been transformed by something so small as a song, that is not something one can carry openly. So they carried it in silence. But silence, too, can hold music. Years passed. The war became something taught in schools, mentioned in textbooks, argued over in parliaments. Photographs yellowed, barracks crumbled. The field where the fire had once burned was overtaken by grass. A few of the cowboys who had served at the camp moved on, some to farms, some to factories, some to places where no one asked what they did during the war. One of them, his name now faded on the corner of a dog-eared roster, had put down his tongs for good. He rarely spoke of the POW camp. When asked, he'd only say, "We cooked, that's all." But there were Sundays when he'd sit out on his porch, watch the horizon melt into the same kind of blue that had blanketed those old campfires, and hum a tune he didn't remember learning. Then, one day, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Japan. The envelope was plain, the handwriting tight and careful. Inside was a photograph, faded at the edges, but still clear. A woman, older now, hair streaked with gray but eyes unmistakable, stood surrounded by children. Some were laughing, others mid-song, mouths open in frozen chorus. In her hands was a harmonica, polished, familiar. She held it not like an instrument, but like a memory. On the back of the photo, in shaky but deliberate English, were just 6 words. "Thank you, you let me sing." The cowboy read it once, then again, slower. He didn't speak Japanese. He didn't need to. He turned the photo over in his hands, thumb tracing the edge of the harmonica. A smile curled across his face, not broad, not loud, just a quiet, knowing smile that settled deep into the corners of his eyes. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, and set the photo next to a worn metal box. Inside were relics of a past he hadn't touched in years, a folded checkered handkerchief, a faded mess hall menu, and a harmonica missing one reed. They were enemies once. That was the truth, written in maps and medals. But there had been one Sunday, maybe 2, where none of that mattered. Beneath barbed wire and blue skies, they had been something simpler, something more dangerous. They had been people, just people, sharing food, sharing songs, sharing silence, and sometimes that's the most subversive act of all. Because kindness is not neutral. It cuts through propaganda, pierces through uniforms, lingers longer than orders. What war could not take, what it tried and failed to strip away, was the simple dignity of being seen, of being heard, of being allowed to sing. Yuki's letter wasn't history. It wasn't testimony. It was something rarer, gratitude with roots that reached across decades. A thank you for a meal, a song, a nod, a moment. It didn't change governments. It didn't end conflict. But it lit a match in a place where matches weren't meant to be struck. And fire, once kindled, remembers how to burn. The cowboy never wrote back. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe there was nothing more to say. But that spring, when the air turned warm and the sky deepened to that old Texas blue, he sat on the porch with the harmonica resting on his knee. And though the reed was still broken, he lifted it to his lips and tried a note. It didn't come out clean. But it came. And in that breath was a memory of a woman in a distant land, of children laughing, of a tune that had once stitched the edges of a broken world back together. If only for a moment, not with treaties, not with speeches, but with song.